International financial governance, the topic of today's program, and is often overlooked until it is staring at us in the face. Yet the importance of cooperation to prevent and prepare for financial crises cannot be emphasized enough, as iterated by the global financial crisis nearly a decade ago. To this end, global institutions such as the G20 and IMF have received significant attention, but complementary institutions at the regional level also play an important role. Today's speaker, Dr. Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, is here to discuss Korea's role within regional financial institutions in East Asia and why this role is important. His presentation will be based on a paper he was recently written for KEI as part of our academic paper series. If you haven't picked it up already, I would highly encourage you to do so on your way out. Dr. Pacheco-Pardo is a senior lecturer in international relations at King's College London and the co-director of the Lunda Asia Pacific Center for Social Science. There is a shortened version of his bio in the program flyer that you all have, but just to add some complementary information, he's currently working on 3 research projects. The first is financial regionalism in East Asia. The second is support for entrepreneurs across East Asia, which is clearly very important right now for South Korea. And the third is EU-East Asian relations. I'm very excited about this program here today, particularly to have Dr. Pacheco-Pardo here to share his expertise with us. So now, without any further delay, I would like to turn things over to him and let him start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming as well, and thanks for the Institute for inviting me to give this talk. I was saying I'm very excited to be able to talk about this topic because coming from London and coming from Europe, where we only discuss really North Korea, we don't really discuss anything else, to have the opportunity to talk about South Korea and East Asia in general, and this topic, which I'm passionate about, is a really incredible opportunity for me. So I'm looking forward as well to the Q&A later on. I've been working on this topic for around 5 years, 6 years, East Asian financial governance, and also I've been teaching about it for the past 4 or 5 years as well. So I'm building on my previous research and teaching experience, but I'm also building on research that I did specifically for this particular paper. I've been asked to talk for a maximum of 45 minutes, which I promise to try to do, and then we'll have time for the Q&A. This is a brief outline of my presentation. I'm going to have a very short introduction, then I'm going to talk about East Asia's financial governance, the developments that have taken place really since 1997, but especially after the global financial crisis. Then I'm going to focus on the 3 key reasons, in my view, why Korea is interested in East Asian financial governance and supporting it. And then I'm going to focus on the importance of Korea having a central role in this particular area, East Asian financial governance. So let's begin. First of all, why I think this is important? Well, first of all, because if you look at what happened after the global financial crisis, suddenly we see how East Asian financial governance becomes strengthened, right? We have the creation of AMRO, Asia Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, Chiang Mai Initiative, Multilateralization, and other developments that I'll touch upon briefly later on. So we see an upgrading of this multi-layer governance in East Asia with this regional layer, which importantly is complementary to other layers. It's complementary to the IMF, for example, and it's complementary to the bilateral swap arrangements that some East Asian countries have among themselves, with the People's Bank of China, for example, and also with the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank. So this East Asian regional layer becomes strengthened and becomes even more complementary to other types of layers that we have affecting East Asia. And now, Korea from the beginning, and this goes back to 1997, Asian financial crisis, and the origins of the layer, but also 2008, under President Lee Myung-bak, when he becomes president, you have seen a strong advocacy of supporting this East Asian layer. I'm going to explain the reasons later on, but what is important for me to understand is that differently from other countries, let's say, for example, China and Japan, but even some Southeast Asian countries, such as Indonesia, Korea has been supporting regional financial governance for a period of some 20 years. And not many other countries can say this. So this is central, I think, to understand Korea's foreign policy. Now, let's go to the substance of the talk. First of all, if we look at financial governance, if you look at East Asia, it started with ASEAN, what we call ASEAN Centrality, that you probably have read about and know about. So if we go back to 1977, we have the ASEAN swap arrangement, 1977, right? A number of bilateral swap arrangements among ASEAN countries, going up to $2 billion later on in the year 2005. This was the only institution that we really had until 1997. And then we have the East Asian financial crisis of 1997, which obviously comes as a shock to the region, as a shock to Korea, the country, as you know, that received the biggest ever bailout from the IMF until Greece, Spain, my country, came along and we started to receive even bigger bailouts than Korea, but for a long period of time it held the record. So you have this shock affecting the region. And you start to see the creation of regional institutions. You see the creation of the Chiang Mai Initiative, for example, in the year 2000. You see the creation of market strengthening mechanisms such as the Asian Bond Market Initiative in the year 2003. You see a dialogue with the ERPD, Economic Review Policy Dialogue, in which all financial ministers from ASEAN plus 3 countries come together, created in 1999, later on becomes part of the Chiang Mai Initiative. So we have this network of organizations. But if you look at the network of organizations created after 1997, you see how they are not necessarily truly regional, with the exception of the Asian Bond Market Initiative. For example, Chiang Mai Initiative is a set of bilateral swap arrangements among the different countries in the region, going up to some 85 billion US dollars by the year 2009. So I would argue that we don't have a truly regional layer or truly regional institutions, with the exception of the Asian Bond Market Initiative. What we see, though, is that starting with the Roh Moo-hyun administration in the case of Korea, the country is going to become an advocate for increasing regionalism, for the strengthening of regional institutions. So if you look at the Chiang Mai Initiative from the year 2005, there are discussions about making it a truly regional institution, which will only happen after the global financial crisis. Korea, from the beginning, started with Roh Moo-hyun, later on with Lee Moon-bak, is actually going to push for this to happen. So you have this advocacy from the beginning from Seoul in this case. And then we have the global financial crisis. And as you probably know, when the global financial crisis hits East Asia as well, eventually it reaches East Asia as well, the Chiang Mai Initiative is not going to be used, right? Countries such as Korea or Singapore, for example, are going to activate the bilateral swap arrangements that they have with the Federal Reserve, but they're not going to go necessarily to the Chiang Mai Initiative. And this is due to 2 factors. One of them, if you look at the Chiang Mai Initiative, even though it was $84 billion, but it was a set of bilateral swap arrangements. So you would have needed to go to every single partner if you wanted to activate this mechanism, and the amount that you could get from every single partner wasn't as much as you could get from the US, right? So the amount itself was very small. But also, to an extent, there was a lack of trust, right? There was a lack of trust on the other countries in the region. And as a result of the crisis, we're going to see developments to try to build this trust and to try to build truly regional institutions. So after the global financial crisis, the Chiang Mai Initiative becomes multilateralized, right? Year 2010. Suddenly, we have $120 billion at the disposal of this institution, which is going to be doubled to $240 billion. Many people argue that this is not enough, $240 billion. For example, Korea in 1997 already received $55 billion from the IMF. But if you look at all the different mechanisms that we have to provide liquidity to countries that have suffered a crisis, you see how this is the biggest mechanism that we have after the European Stability Mechanism. Now, the European Stability Mechanism applies to the Eurozone, so countries that share a currency. But if you look at countries that don't share a currency, such as the case of East Asia, this is the biggest mechanism that we have, $240 billion. If you look, for example, at the European Financial Stabilization mechanism that we have is some $80 billion. So it is actually less than the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. So in my view, this is an important development. Not only this, the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization, following on the steps of the IMF, is actually going to launch a precautionary line. So if a country thinks that it is going to suffer a crisis, it can actually activate the mechanism. So again, another development that I think is important to understand the increasing importance of these institutions. Interestingly, if you go to Frankfurt or Brussels, for example, or you go to Luxembourg and you talk to European officials, when they started to implement, or when they actually agreed to implement a precautionary line as well, it was as a result of what the IMF had done, but also a result of what East Asian countries had done. The thinking was, if East Asian countries are ready to have this precautionary line, European Union member states or Eurozone countries should have the same facility. So you see how in this case the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization serves as an example to other initiatives. Then you have AMRO, ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office. I don't know if you've been to the headquarters based in Singapore, but what you see with AMRO is something that I think is quite exceptional, right? You have officials from ASEAN Plus 3 countries, ASEAN Plus 3 including Hong Kong as well, working together in monitoring and surveilling activities. And as you know, as of 2016, AMRO became the first international organization, legally the first international organization in which ASEAN Plus 3 countries have actually decided that this is not going to be a mechanism in which they meet from time to time, but actually this organization has the power to carry on its activities without having to ask member states whether they can do so. So again, an important development. Now, I have had the chance to talk to people who have been involved in the AMRO process from both sides of the table, those who are part of AMRO and those who are part of the surveillance of AMRO, for example, in Japan and other countries, and they say that it serves a very important purpose. It allows ASEAN Plus 3 countries to know the economic situation in each other and to discuss it privately, but also, so this year, as you know, the annual reports being published by AMRO are actually going to be made public as well. So there is a degree of accountability there that was not in existence before AMRO. So I think this is another important development. We have surveillance, monitoring. Part of it is actually done in private. It's not shared with the public, but it's shared among central banks, for example, and ministries of finance and governance. But we also have the accountability component, something that ASEAN Plus 3 countries were not willing to do before. And then if you look at the ERPD, you see how it is being upgraded, right? And you not only have ministers of finance anymore, you also have central banks. So you have those in charge of financial policy, fiscal policy, and monetary policy meeting each other on an annual basis, on a regular basis, to monitor what's the situation in the region. So I think these are substantial developments that took place in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And what role does Korea play within this East Asian financial governance, and why does it play? I'm going to start with the why. First of all, I'm going to talk about the growing role of financial markets in the domestic economy in South Korea. It goes back to the 1990s, but again enhanced following 2008. I'm going to talk about how South Korea sees itself within East Asia and at the global level, and where does it see itself in terms of financial governance, its role as a middle power. And then I'm going to talk about the support that Korea has for ASEAN Plus 3, that I already touched upon, but also importantly, the decreasing importance of ASEAN to financial governance in the region, which I think leaves a void that South Korea is trying to fill. So let's start with financial markets. One of my areas of research is actually the creative economy in South Korea. Now, if you look at how financial markets operate in the region, we all know 1990s, Korea starts to open its financial sector, then the 1997 crisis comes along, but the opening process and the role of markets in the country hasn't stopped since there. So we have an economic model which has moved from catch-up development to competition at the frontier stage in areas such as biotech, robotics, automobile, even shipbuilding, semiconductors. These are all capital-intensive industries. And the banks that you have in Korea cannot fulfill the capital needs of the modern Korean economy. So you need a greater role for markets, for foreign direct investment coming into the country to lead economic growth in the country. And as you know, chaebols as well have become decreasingly dependent on bank lending, and now, for example, are listed obviously in different stock exchanges, and are also more open to international capital. So you see the importance of markets in the Korean economy. Plus, if you go back to the Park Geun-hye administration, not very popular these days, but she started the Creative Economy Action Plan. Now, the Creative Economy Action Plan, if you look at it, it was based on supporting startups, right, such as Coupang, for example, that now has become very popular, as you know, in Korea. These startups that can actually provide thousands of jobs. In the case of Coupang, something like 6,000 to 7,000 jobs created since it was launched a few years ago, especially to young people that might not find employment in other places. Now, the Moon Jae-in administration is continuing with this policy. Obviously, it's changing the name because he doesn't want to be tainted by Park Geun-hye, but the policies are basically the same. And 3 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Ministry of SMEs and Startups that has been launched by the new administration, which is in Techon actually, talking to people there, and they said, well, startups are key to the economic policy of the Moon Jae-in administration. It's not only about public jobs, it's not only about creating regular employment. Now, if you look at where startups receive capital, and I'm leaving the US aside because Silicon Valley is very different from other places, for the most part, they have very limited access to bank credit. Banks don't want to lend to startups. They're very risky, right? And especially in Korea, if you can lend to, well, the housing sector, but also to very well-known economies that you know are going to repay their loans, why would you lend to a company that might not have the means to repay its debt? So you see the importance of markets for these small, medium-sized enterprises that have to compete at the frontier stage. So with Park Geun-hye, for example, you see the launch of Konex, right? The 2013 launch stock exchange that is there to support exit strategies for startups that are in their 3rd or 4th year of existence. So markets are becoming more important for South Korea. At the same time, you see this move, as I said, towards market-based credit allocation, but you also see FDI. After 1997, for a period of time, if you look at measures of capital account openness, you see how Korea starts to close down its capital account, but then from the mid-2000s, so even before the conservative governments came to power under Roh Moo-hyun, capital account openness starts to increase once again in Korea. So Korea wants to attract more FDI. Now, if you look at the type of FDI that Korea is trying to attract, is trying to attract FDI that is more sustainable than the hot money that it received during the 1990s. So you see, for example, the Foreign Investment Act that was first approved in 1998, has been modified several times. If you look at the modifications, you can check this online if you're interested. You see how it is geared towards attracting a capital that will stay in the country for a period of time, let's say at the very least a couple of years, if not longer. So investment, for example, to open factories, etc., etc. So if you want to attract this better quality FDI, you need this openness. Now, if you have this openness, you start to see why Korea wants to support East Asian financial governance, because there are many risks associated with it. You have the risk of a repeat of the 1997 crisis. Even if you think it might not happen again, you never know. And having these regional financial governance mechanisms is a way to mitigate the potential risks of having liquidity shortages, for example, investment money leaving the country, withdrawal of investment from the country. Or, for example, let's say there is a crash in the stock exchange, something that doesn't seem likely right now, but who knows in a year time, in a couple of years' time. So this regional layer helps to mitigate risks. Not only risks of Korea suffering from a crisis, but also, from my interviews, something which is very important for officials working with the Korean government, for example, the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, for example, the Bank of Korea, the potential of a crisis in another country, especially in Southeast Asia, is spreading to South Korea. So there is a fear that, let's say, there is a crisis in Thailand, as happened in 1997, or a crisis in Indonesia, or a crisis in Malaysia, for example, and what happens if investors start to think, well, Korea might be the next one, the domino effect. There is a real fear in Korea that this might happen. So they see this East Asian financial governance as a means to mitigate the potential risk of a crisis spreading from Southeast Asia all the way to Korea, as happened in 1997. So this is one of the key reasons why Korea supports regional governance. Secondly, it has to do with diplomacy. How South Korea sees itself in the international institutions, but also at the regional level. If you go back to Roh Moo-hyun, in my view, he was the first South Korean president that started to articulate a middle power policy for South Korea that went beyond dealing with North Korea. So he started to look at areas, for example, such as aid, right? Aid to developing countries, right? After Korea had actually joined the OECD in the 1990s. He started to talk, for example, about having a diplomacy that was independent from the US, right? He thought that Korea, for a very long period of time, had been very close to the US. So what happens if Korea wants to engage, for example, in areas such as peacekeeping or peace building? Why don't we do it independently from the alliance that we have with the US? So we started to look at this. But I think there was a qualitative change with the Lee Myung-bak government. The Lee Myung-bak government not only further articulated this policy, but also started to put the economic means and the diplomatic means for South Korea to become an important middle power. This also touches on financial governance. So, you probably know, the first G20 meeting outside of a Western country was actually in Seoul in the year 2010. In the year 2009, a few months before, Korea had joined the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, right? She became part of this institution that is involved in global financial governance. Now, Korea might not have a very important role to play in financial governance, and if you talk to one of the interviews I did with a Ministry of Finance official for this paper, he actually made it very clear, we don't lead discussions about Basel III implementation, for example, but we are seen as a responsible stakeholder because we implement the agreements that are reached within these institutions, which not all countries do, and we do it very quickly. So this actually enhanced the diplomatic position of South Korea, the fact that it is seen not only someone sitting on the table and agreeing to something but then not implementing it, but it's seen as a country that is actually willing to implement the agreements reached by the international community. If you look at the G20, for example, in the Seoul meeting, it was the first time that we started to talk seriously about global imbalances, and we started to talk about the relationship between developed and developing countries and how financial crises in developed countries affect developing countries in different ways because they are less developed in terms of the financial sector as well. So Korea started to portray itself as a bridge between developed and developing countries. So you see how it starts to see this role. Korea also was involved, for example, in discussions about changing the IMF quotas. I mean, Koreans themselves, they say they were central to discussions about the reform of IMF quotas, but then Chinese said the same, Indians said the same, they all said the same. But at the very least, there is this self-perception that we do have a role to play. Having said that, Korea understands that it plays a far bigger role within East Asia. For obvious reasons, right? It is the third biggest economy in ASEAN plus 3. It is one of the most developed countries in the region, so it is seen, for example, as an example of a successful, of a country that has successfully graduated from developing emerging status to developed status by countries in Southeast Asia. So Korea plays a more important role when it comes to ASEAN plus 3. And what does Korea do within ASEAN plus 3? How does it see itself within ASEAN plus 3? First of all, and very important from a Korean perspective, but also from an ASEAN perspective, Korea plays a balancing role between Japan and China. So let's take the example of the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. There was a discussion about the quotas of this initiative. There was a discussion about borrowing. How much can different countries borrow from the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization? There was a discussion about voting power. What is the voting share for each country within Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization? So Korea actually was one of the countries, and this has been told to me not only by Koreans but also by officials from other countries. I've done some fieldwork in China and Japan, for example, in Hong Kong as well, and in Singapore, that Korea actually played a role in trying to get this right, to make sure that China and Japan had, for example, the same voting share, the same contribution, that South Korea was in the middle, and that different ASEAN countries that are really the borrowers from the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization had different voting shares and had different borrowing rights according to their contributions. So Korea played an important role in the technicalities of the agreement. Also, when UNRWA was created, Korea was one of the countries that was pushing more heavily for the creation of this institution, and very importantly, for this institution to become an international organization and therefore be legally independent from the member states. And that's something that Korea was actually banging for until it happened in 2016, right? For example, it was banging on other countries for them to sign the agreement once it had been approved by the different countries. So you see how Korea actually plays an important role in the technicalities of how these institutions actually work. And why is this the case? Well, one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, Korea sees the economic benefits of these institutions, but Korea also sees the second benefit, which is the fact that diplomatically, its role has been enhanced within the region in an area in which other countries, Japan and China, as I mentioned before, are not always willing to take a leading role because of issues that I will mention later on. So Korea sees itself as having an important role within ASEAN Plus 3. We have this self-perception and active role as a middle power. Thirdly, from the beginning, Korea has been supporting ASEAN Plus 3 institutionalization. There are different reasons for this. Some of them already mentioned them, the potential economic benefits, preventing a crisis, the diplomatic role that South Korea can play. But also, very importantly, South Korea actually has the human resources and the financial resources to provide this support. So if you look at the staffing of AMRO, you will see that at the highest level, it is populated by Koreans and Japanese, also some Singaporeans, and especially Hong Kongese. Obviously, there are officials from other places as well, from Laos, from Vietnam. But if you look at the key positions, I mean, you can check them online later on, you will see that people from these countries have a leading role, have a management role within this institution, because they have the knowledge, they have the expertise. Some of them dealt with the 1997 crisis, some others haven't, but they do have the knowledge and they're recognized for having this knowledge. So having the human resources is really important in a region in which not always other countries are willing or have the capability to provide the necessary resources to run these organizations. If you look, for example, at the potential implementation of the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization, you will need officials that have been at the receiving end of a similar program, an IMF program. So South Korea would potentially play a very important role that is recognized within the region as well. If a country needs to go to Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization, it has to borrow from this initiative, but also, as you know, 70% of any CMI program is linked to the IMF. You need someone with experience of implementing IMF programs in the past, and Korea is one of the countries, it's only the only developed country actually in East Asia that has this recent experience. So you have these human capabilities, plus the financial resources. Yes, China and Japan are the biggest contributors to this initiative, but Korea is the third largest contributor by far, actually, compared to the ASEAN countries. So it is an important contributor. So other countries would be borrowing Korean money if they decide to activate this mechanism. Plus, something that is starting to happen, the Bank of Korea is thinking about setting its own bilateral network of swap arrangements with as many Southeast Asian countries as possible. This would also be, to an extent, related to this ASEAN Plus 3 institutionalization. So this is one of the reasons. Second reason, in South Korea you have seen support for ASEAN Plus 3 institutionalization coming from the president, coming from the top. If you look at countries such as Japan and China, and you interview people working there, they said, well, this is something that, Xi Jinping, Shinzo Abe are not really thinking about. They don't really care too much about this. It's more the officials at a working level, Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, for example, sometimes Ministry of Trade as well, that are pushing for ASEAN Plus 3 institutionalization. In Korea, support comes from the top. We don't know with the Moon Jae administration, he hasn't really developed a policy with regards to this, but at the very least, he hasn't decided, let's forget about this and focus on other matters. The three previous presidents, Roh Moo-hyun, Lee Myung-bak, and Park Geun-hye, they actually supported these initiatives much more clearly, as I mentioned, with Lee Myung-bak maybe than with the other two. This is very important, because once you know they have the support of the president, you know that suddenly support for these initiatives is not to be withdrawn because the president has other priorities and wants to focus on other matters. Now, this support for ASEAN Plus 3 institutionalization, first of all, is related to something I mentioned before that I want to touch a little bit more in detail now. Loss of confidence. There is this fear in Korea that many investors still see Korea as an emerging market, not necessarily as a developed country, and this fear that some investors or many investors still lump Korea with less developed Southeast Asian countries. So they might think about Korea in terms of investment risk as something similar to Malaysia, for example, Indonesia, even the Philippines has been mentioned a couple of times in my discussions, right? Nothing wrong with these countries, but they are less developed than Korea. Now, This leads to the loss of confidence that could happen within the region and how this could affect Korea if investors start to think in this way, right? As I mentioned before, something happens in Thailand, the same is going to happen in Korea. So this actually is one of the drivers of Korean support for institutionalization. But also there is the cost effectiveness. I haven't talked to anyone that seriously considers that Korea would need to go to the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. But it might happen. It might happen insofar Korea doesn't have, for example, the level of reserves that China and Japan do, right? It is one of the top 10 largest countries in terms of the level of reserves, but still is not at the same level as China and Japan. Plus, Korea, as I mentioned before, by some investors, it is seen in the same light as other countries in Southeast Asia. So, if a crisis were to happen, Korea would be able to borrow up to 38.4 billion from the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. So it's not the 55 billion that they had to borrow from the IMF, but it's a substantial amount. So coupled with bilateral swap arrangements that they might have with the European Central Bank, for example, or the Federal Reserve, coupled with its own reserves, with different mechanisms, right, it would be able to withstand a crisis in a cost-effective way. It would be cost-effective because if you look at the way the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization is set up, the capital is not paid in, right? It is pledged capital. So this means that the capital would come from, especially from Japan and China. If Korea or another country were to suffer the crisis, the capital would be borrowed by South Korea, but South Korea wouldn't necessarily need to contribute, there is a discussion about this, wouldn't necessarily need to contribute to its own rescue package, to put it in these terms. So it is actually cost effective. You don't have to put in money that you might have to borrow. This would be capital coming from other countries. So you have this cost effectiveness argument that I've heard from some of my interviewees, and it's in the literature as well. But at the same time, very important, ASEAN has lost its centrality to institutions in the region. If we go back all the way to the 1990s, and I see some young faces here, but in the 1990s I was studying these things already. So 1994, we have the ASEAN Regional Forum. 1992, ASEAN Free Trade Area. Early to mid-2000s, ASEAN FTAs with China, Japan, and Korea. ASEAN was really at the center of the different institutions being created within the region, right? Same with ASEAN plus 3 institutions. But you start to see a change before the global financial crisis and especially after the global financial crisis. You start to see how ASEAN countries start to have divisions among themselves. One clear example is FTAs. 2007, I want to bring an example from Europe. The European Union starts to have a discussion with ASEAN about an FTA, region-to-region FTA. By the year 2009, because of issues have to do with Myanmar, I'm not going to go into detail, but issues have to do with Myanmar, this bilateral agreement between the EU and ASEAN collapses. And what do ASEAN countries do? Each of them starts to negotiate its own bilateral agreement with the European Union. So you see this ASEAN unity is actually folding because each of the countries in the region has its own interest. And today, for example, Singapore and Vietnam have already signed an FTA with the European Union. Countries such as Malaysia are discussing an FTA with the European Union. Same with the US. US has FTAs with some countries in the region as well. So you see how ASEAN unity starts to disintegrate at the same time as you see the rise of China. So China starts to become more important to developments in the region. And now, for example, after the collapse of TPP, you see how RCEP is to an extent being led, well, it's actually being led by China, it's not actually being led by ASEAN countries. But even if you look at TPP, you saw how some ASEAN countries were part of this agreement, while some other countries were not. So ASEAN unity actually collapses. This ASEAN unity also collapses because you start to see Indonesia, once it becomes, or it realizes the importance of its role, at least from its perspective, within the G20, Indonesia starts to have its own independent role as well when it comes to discussion about finance, when it comes to discussion about economics. You see a country such as Malaysia that wants to become a leader in Islamic finance. And again, Malaysia, because it wants to have this role, it starts to distance itself from other ASEAN countries that are more reluctant maybe to have this Islamic finance as part of their financial sector. You see how Singapore, even though it is not a permanent member of the G20, it is a permanent guest of the G20. So Singapore also starts to have its own independent role. Also interestingly, I heard that in Basel, actually, well, I've been told that in Basel, the Monetary Authority of Singapore is also trying to have its own independent role. It doesn't represent ASEAN anymore. I mean, it's representing its own self-interest, right? So you start to see this disunity among ASEAN countries when it comes to financial matters, when it comes to economic matters. So ASEAN doesn't present a single voice in the way it did before. And if you look at ASEAN itself, in theory, it is a permanent guest of the G20, but this year, for example, it wasn't invited, right, because of President Duterte. Philippines had the rotating presidency of ASEAN. They decided not to invite him. So even if ASEAN wanted to have a single voice when it comes to these international institutions, sometimes it is not sitting on the table. So this disunity has actually created a void in terms of who can lead further regionalism or who can maintain the current institutions within the region. Which takes me to the last bit, which is the importance of Korea's centrality to East Asia's regional financial governance. Something that I always ask in class, I'm not going to do today, is to my Asian students, is who thinks that regional financial governance in East Asia is important to the countries. And very few people actually think, well, it doesn't really matter to my country. That tends to be the general answer. And now you see how China tries to have the internationalization of the renminbi. The People's Bank of China has its own bilateral swap arrangements. The Central Bank of Japan, the Bank of Japan is also having its own bilateral swap arrangements. So you start to see how some countries, the two big economic powers in the region, are trying to have their own bilateral networks with other countries. But having said that, this goes back to the point that I made at the beginning. These are not necessarily or always in competition to the regional layer. So the regional layer still matters insofar it is there. It is having an important role, for example, when it comes to surveillance and monitoring. It is having an important role in having a permanent forum for central bankers, ministers of finance in the region, having a permanent forum to discuss economic matters, to discuss financial matters. The Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization hasn't been activated, that is true, but the fact that it is still there, and again, as I mentioned before, it is the biggest mechanism that we have if we leave aside the Eurozone one, the European Stability Mechanism that we have to provide liquidity to countries in distress. All these different issues actually do matter, if only because, for example, they help to bring confidence to the region and especially to countries in Southeast Asia. So it is important that we still have these institutions, that they haven't collapsed, that they continue to exist, and in the case of UNRWA, for example, that it has an increasingly important role when it comes to the monitoring of the economic situation in the region, the monitoring of the financial situation in the region. So Korea matters for three reasons. First of all, it continues to play a balancing role between Tokyo and Beijing. So when there are disagreements between Beijing and Tokyo, for example, after Yoichi Nemoto stepped down as the director of UNRWA, he had to be replaced by a Chinese. And this became very controversial. Who are we going to appoint? And in the end, Korea actually helped to choose someone that was amenable to Tokyo as well, right? So he helped, for example, with the next director of UNRWA. And for a period of time, it wasn't clear that there was going to be someone that Beijing and Tokyo could agree on. So you see this role, for example, being played by South Korea. Important as well, South Korea is seen as a neutral actor. So if you look at surveys being conducted in ASEAN about how do you perceive China, how do you perceive Japan, how do you perceive South Korea, with China, some people have positive perceptions, some people have negative perceptions, same with Japan. When it comes to Korea, nobody thinks that it wants to have dominance within the region, nobody thinks that it wants to control the economic policy, financial policy of countries in the region. Nobody thinks that Korea, for example, wants to dominate UNRWA, or that Korea would try to dominate any lending being done by the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization. It is perceived as a country that it is an honest broker. It will play this neutral role. It will try to bridge differences between the different countries. And this actually matters in a region in which, as you know, there are all these concerns about the competition between Beijing and Tokyo. But also, very importantly, Korea is something that I think has done very cleverly, and this comes from discussions with people working in UNRWA from Southeast Asian countries, people from Laos, Philippines, for example, Vietnam as well. Korea is seen as this bridge between developed and developing countries. A country that in the 1990s suffered when it tried to open up its capital account, so it can draw on its own experience. A country that during the interim period 1997 to 2017 has already started to open up as well to attract foreign direct investment, to launch stock exchanges, which is something that Southeast Asian countries want to do. Now, you could argue these countries could actually look at Japan, but in many cases they see Japan as too distant for two reasons. First of all, Japan is the third biggest economy in the world, much bigger population than most countries in the region, if we leave maybe Indonesia and Vietnam aside. So they don't really see Japan as an example anymore. They see themselves, or they can see themselves in the example of Korea more than the example of Japan. But also something that in my view Korea has also done very well. Korea is using its development experience, including development of the financial sector, as an example for other countries, both from its successes, but also from its mistakes. So if you go to Seoul, or if you go to the Korea Development Institute, for example, which now moved to Sejong, if you go to these institutions, you see many Southeast Asian officials that are taking 1-2-year masters that are learning from Korean officials, right? In the past, they might have gone to other countries, especially they might have gone to Tokyo. But these days, actually, they go to South Korea to learn from its development experience. An interesting phenomenon. Last time I was in Seoul, 3 weeks ago, actually, there was these 3 officials from Myanmar, actually, that are trying to learn from the development of the Korean financial sector, for example, right? So a country such as Myanmar sees Korea as a potential example about how to liberalize the financial sector and how to avoid the problems that Korea had in the 1990s. So Korea plays an important role because it is this bridge between developed and developing countries. So to summarize, and I think I'm going to be in time, yeah, great. Korea is central to the continuation of and strengthening of East Asia's regional financial governance for the reasons that I have mentioned, and we can discuss this further during the Q&A that we will have now. And there are these 3 main factors that from my research show why Korea is central. First of all, the economic realities of how the Korean economy has developed and the importance of capital markets for the model of the Korean model as a developed country. Power projection, Korea trying to portray itself as a middle power, going beyond the issues of North Korea, but looking at other matters as well, including finance. And finally, it has been supporting these initiatives going all the way back to the 1990s. And as I said, many other countries haven't been willing to do this. But in Korea, it seems that it doesn't matter if you have a liberal or a conservative in power. This is an issue in which successive presidents in South Korea, they think they have an important role to play, and they continue to support regional financial governance in East Asia. Thank you very much. I will leave it there, and I look forward to the Q&A.
I know you expressed concern on timing, but it's very clear that you're a professor having to meet those the bell schedule.
My students get angry when I get the question.
You did actually a really great job of making Korea's role in regional financial cooperation accessible, because I know it can kind of be an alphabet soup between Chiang Mai Initiative, Multilateralization, AMRO, EPRD, et cetera, et cetera. So I just commend you on that before I. Is that better? Okay. You had mentioned that in the CMIM, the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, there is a 70%, essentially meaning that for that $38.4 billion that you had referenced that Korea can withdraw, only 30% of that would be able to be withdrawn without IMF conditionality. And there was plans once the CMIM was increased from 120 billion to 240 billion in 2012. That in 2014, that this delinkage would be from 30% to 40% would be increased in 2014. Yet time and time again, we haven't seen this jump, this 30 to 40% jump increase. Can you explain, or at least offer your opinion on why this might be the case, and have we seen sort of a ceiling in the CMIM, at least until the next financial crisis comes around?
Thank you. I'll give you the reasons that I've been given, right? First of all, we all have this idea that ASEAN plastic countries don't trust the IMF because of what happened in 1997. But something I heard expressed time and time again is that some of them, they trust themselves even less, right? So yes, we might not trust the IMF because of what happened in 1997, but if I'm Indonesia, do I really trust the Chinese, for example, right? These type of things. And vice versa, the lenders, Japan and China and Korea, they do think if I give certain amount of capital to a particular country, are they going to eventually return it, right? So this is one of the reasons that I have been given. The other reason that I have been given is that, as you said, because there hasn't been a crisis since 2008, there is no perceived need to proceed with this until, as you said, there is another crisis, and suddenly we will have the urgency to try to make the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization operational. This comes more from the people working in AMRO, who really would like it to go beyond 40%. I mean, some people say eventually 100%, right? In the future, who knows, right? But they would like this to happen. We have to wait for the next crisis, right? And those are the two main reasons that I'm given. On the first one, on the lack of trust, it seems to come not from the working level, but more from the high level, presidential, prime ministerial level. Because at the working level, something that you realize when you go to Singapore and meet these people, or you go to Seoul and you talk to the people who have been dealing with AMRO, they'll say, well, I mean, we all realize that if there is a crisis somewhere in the region, if China suffers a crisis, we're all going to suffer from it. Same if it happens in one of the countries in Southeast Asia. So there should be more cooperation. But this doesn't seem to have filtered all the way to the leaders in the region. And if there is a crisis, this might happen. Having said that, it is true that now the focus seems to be more on crisis prevention. So there's this focus on, let's get AMRO right. If we need to use the precautionary line, let's learn when do we need to use the precautionary line, and there are discussions with the IMF, for example, about how would this work, because they think the IMF might know better than ASEAN plus 3 plastic countries. So the focus seems to be more on this crisis prevention. How do we prevent a crisis rather than how do we solve a potential crisis? So there seems to be no urgency right now on increasing the ceiling, actually. Yeah.
I know I could go on, but
Hi, I was curious to hear a little bit more about the creative economy that you were speaking about. In your paper, you mentioned that Korea opened a CONEX index for small SMEs and startups, and you also mentioned that there's some reluctance on the part of big banks to invest in startups. Why exactly is that? And then also, has there been an uptick in FDI in this creative economy and startups in South Korea, or is there any momentum there?
Yeah, I will answer this question then. So I've been working on this project maybe 2.5 years now, and I've done 3 rounds of interviews in Seoul, which has been very useful with policymakers from government, both from the PAC administration and from the current administration. I've also talked to entrepreneurs, and I've also talked to from creative ecosystem, entrepreneurial ecosystem players, right? So people working in accelerators, for example. So that's where my answer is coming from. When it comes to CONEX, one of the big problems that Korean startups had is that once they reach a certain level and they had to grow more, really their only option was to sell themselves to the chaebols if they wanted to grow further. And some of them didn't want to do this, because once you do this, you basically lose control over your company. And one of the things that the PAC government did was launch CONEX in 2013, which is aimed especially as startups in the 3rd or 4th year, right? So after the first 2 years, they have to raise more capital. And if you look, the information is actually publicly available. You can go to Conex. I think it's in Korean, most of the information. But you can see, for example, the number of companies that have joined the stock market. There has been an important uptake, actually. The idea with Conex is that these companies, after a certain period of time, they will be able to graduate and move to COSDAQ or even COSPI. And some of them had started to do this. So it's an important exit strategy that wasn't available to Korean companies before, and it's something that has been very helpful for people who, as I said, don't want to sell their business to tables. Now, second question. Yeah, there has been increasing investment into Korea, and since this is being recorded, I can tell you a bit more later. But for example, when Google decided to open its campus in Asia, it looked at different Asian cities, right? And without going into why it didn't choose Tokyo or Singapore, it actually went for Seoul. And it was a very quick decision. And I know the person who actually launched Google Campus in Korea, right? Because they realized that A, there was government support, but B, that Korea was starting to attract interest from international investors. So you have funds, for example, like 500 Kimchi, which is actually made with money coming from Silicon Valley. You have funds, venture capital funds, for example, from Israel that have opened operations in Korea as well. Funds, for example, from London that have opened their own VC funds, for example, in Seoul as well. In many cases, this is the only operation that they have in the whole of Asia. So it's a way to enter the Asian market, so to speak, to see what's the environment, the startup ecosystem within the region, within Asia. But also they see Korea as a potential bridge, because many of these companies they are investing in, because the Korean market is quite small, right? Maybe some 50 million people. When they start to look at international opportunities, they look at Southeast Asia, they look at China, Hong Kong, Japan, etc., etc. So they see the potential of investing in a company that eventually is going to go overseas. And there are, for example, app makers in Korea that have started to operate in other Asian countries, or perhaps obviously KakaoTalk, for example, so some that are better known. So yeah, investment is flowing. Having said that, most of the investment still comes from KIVIC, the Korea Venture Investment Corporation, set up in 2005, but ever since then has been the main investor in the Korean entrepreneurial ecosystem. It is still the largest investor. Now, the idea is for KIVIC to eventually have a smaller role and for more international investors to come into Korea. But KIVIC is set up to provide funding all the way until 2035, a 30-year period. So this is not going to happen tomorrow, but it is true that it has started to happen, for example, these international investors that I'm talking about. Another thing that the Korean government is doing is it is sending Korean companies overseas. So they might send a bunch of Korean companies to Silicon Valley or to Tel Aviv or to London to meet with investors. Has this been successful? It has been in the sense that some of these companies have started to receive funding or have, for example, set up operations in Palo Alto, for example, or in Tel Aviv, right? So they have started to do this as well. And in this way, they start to receive investment in the countries in which they are operating. Very difficult to get the actual figures. Among other things, because these are private companies, they don't really need to disclose anything. They don't have the need. But yeah, you see this actually happening in Korea. And it is very interesting because that project, we compare Seoul with Tokyo, Taipei, and Hong Kong. And Seoul and Taipei are by far the most advanced entrepreneurial ecosystems in Northeast Asia. I mean, Tokyo is nowhere close to it. That's why I don't want to say much, but I think Japan is really behind on this, and Hong Kong, because of the dominance of the financial sector, cannot really compete right now. It's very expensive for a startup to go to Hong Kong right now. And that's not the case, actually. In Seoul, you see this ecosystem being created. All of you, I guess, have been to Korea. I mean, if you go to Gangnam, there is one after another. You have one accelerator here, you have one incubator here, you have a startup here, then you have another one across the road. If you go to Kuro, for example, where you used to have the digital complex, right? You see the same. You see the same mechanism operating. And you do see international faces as well. that you don't necessarily see, for example, in Japan. You don't see many people from Europe or from the US thinking, okay, I'm going to set up my startup in Japan, but it is happening in Korea. So you have these people, they bring, for example, their investment opportunities because they might know how to attract investment from their home country. Plus something that is very important for Korea and for Taiwan as well, many Korean Americans who have experience, normally in California, or many Koreans who have studied and worked in California and then they go back. Taiwan has the same with many Taiwanese Americans or Taiwanese who studied here. Japan doesn't have that. Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of Vietnam, don't actually have that. That's very important as well. And that has led the development. I'm quite positive about it because the Moon Jae-in government has made very clear that it's going to continue with the same policy. And it has created a ministry that actually says startups. Might be the only, maybe Israel has the same, I don't know. But a ministry that actually says startups in its name is very, very unusual. But later I can tell you more without being recorded, actually.
I know, Mike Billington, I'm with Executive Intelligence Review. I know you're mostly focused on ASEAN, but I want to ask about Russia, which is playing an increasingly important role in East Asia. You probably know that Moon Jae-in was just in Vladivostok for the Eastern Economic Forum, and in a long meeting with Putin, they both strongly committed to collaborate in Korea's role in the development of the Russian Far East, including restoring these triangular agreements like at Rason with Russia, China, Russia, and North and South Korea. So I'm wondering if you might want to comment on that, but also do you suspect that where the financing would come for these kinds of projects, and do you think perhaps the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road, or the AIIB, or the BRICS New Development Bank might interface with that process?
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the help. My name is Randy Henning. I'm at American University. Thank you for this presentation, which is very comprehensive and detailed. My question has two parts. The one was to follow up on your earlier discussion of the Chiang Mai Initiative and the increase in the de-linked portion of the CMI from 30% to 40%. I was curious if you could kind of explain the Korean position on this question of increasing the de-linked portion, and maybe I'll broaden that to talk a little bit about whether Korea in these forums and as it participates in ASEAN Plus 3 is behaving as taking positions of a borrower, or is it behaving as a creditor? Okay, so I'll toss out a hypothesis, and that is that over time Korea is increasingly behaving like a creditor, right? And that's why I ask about the position on the increase in the de-linked portion as a little bit of a insight into that question. The second part has to do with the mention that you had earlier in the presentation about the Bank of Korea being interested in extending swap arrangements to Southeast Asian countries. This is an interesting development, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Is the thought that this would be in local currency, or would be a U.S. dollar swap? And what's the demand on the part of the Southeast Asians for this kind of swap from the Bank of Korea? Are they showing interest? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Without being an expert in Russia, I'll tell you something that I do know. That is that when it comes to attracting investment, I have found out that Korea is looking beyond the U.S., Europe, China, and Japan. And Russia is an obvious target for Korea in terms of who could invest in the Korean economy, right? Because Korea doesn't really have any diplomatic problems with Russia. Russia, as you know, I mean, in Europe, the perception of Russia is extremely, extremely negative. There's this talk in some countries about monitoring Russian investment. I've even heard the word banning or imposing sanctions on Russian investment, which it would be an incredible step taken by the European Union. So Russia itself has to look for other investment opportunities as well. And Korea is a country with which it has no real problems. So if you look at the Creative Economy Initiative, for example, most of the investment has come from, so far, from the US, Israel, starting to come from Western Europe as well. But something I noticed in my latest trip, which was, I think it was three weeks ago, the government of Seoul, not the Korean government, the government of Seoul, is starting to, has actually launched its own initiatives to create its own startup ecosystem, and you do have Russians there. So if you go to, I forgot now the name of the center, but they have a center where only foreigners can operate, or foreigners operate together with Koreans. It's in Yongsan, actually, in the electronics market. They have put it there. You do see Russians there, right? And one of the reasons is, A, they have skills, they're very strong in technical skills, but B, they do have capital. There are no questions asked about where the capital is coming from, but they do have capital, and that's important from a South Korean perspective, because it means diversification. So the fact that there are no problems with Russia in this particular area, I think is important for the Koreans. Plus, if you look at younger Koreans who might find that they have not as many job opportunities today as they had, let's say, before 1997. I mean, I come from Spain, right? So whenever Koreans complain about high youth unemployment, we have 50% in Spain, I said, yeah, whatever, right? But leaving that aside, it is a place in which I have noticed, from when I deliver lectures there, it is a place that younger Koreans consider as somewhere where they could spend a number of years, right? For example, there are Korean banks that they do have operations in Russia, might want to expand operations in Russia, might be thinking about opening shop in Russia. So that's a place, and actually I do have a friend. I did exchange agreement in 2003 in Korea, and I have a friend who is now manager of the Korean, the Russian branch of a Korean bank in Russia, actually. So he's actually managing their operations there. So there are these links that maybe we don't talk as much about, but they do exist. I know a little bit more about the second part of your question, which is about AIB and Silk Road Fund. I don't know if you noticed, but the first ever meeting of the AIB outside of China was actually in Seoul, right? The meeting was actually, interestingly, next to the American Embassy, right? So next to the American Embassy, you had the meeting of the AIB, the first one outside of China. Plus, as we all know, Korea was one of the countries that signed, that joined the AIB before it was actually launched, and there are Korean officials working in the AIB, seconded to the AIB, or working with the AIB. So they do see the potential for investment, definitely. On a separate paper that I'm developing with a colleague based in Singapore, who is based in the Asian Development Bank, we look at the AIB, and we look about the potential for AIB cooperation with the ADB or with the World Bank, with different banks, because they do have agreements, right? They have actually signed agreements. The World Bank, for example, has an agreement. And part of this agreement is training of AIB officials, but part of it is also co-financing of initiatives. So you would receive money from the World Bank plus the AIB, or the AIB together with the ADB. So leaving aside the geopolitics, but the realities of the needs for investment. Now the AIB, in theory, it is looking more at developing countries that have more infrastructure needs, but nothing in the AIB says that it couldn't invest in South Korea, that could invest in any country, or you would have Korean companies that would actually, through the AIB, would be able to lend to other countries, maybe even together with the Russians. So there is potential for cooperation there. And the agreements, I don't think they're available online, but I mean, if you email the World Bank, they will send it to you. That's how I got it, actually. So they are willing to share them and to say, look, we do have an agreement with the AIB, we do have this partnership, and we might have joint projects being implemented. So there is the potential there. But I wouldn't go in any more detail because I don't know specifically what might have happened.
What about Korea's investments into Russia rather than Russian investments in Korea?
So on that bit, something that I find interesting beyond these banks that open shop in Russia, that to a large extent they seem to be catering for Korean expats in the region and Russians that might want to have a deposit there in a Korean bank. That's what I have noticed. You do see companies looking at frontier markets, right? Thinking outside the box, not only investing in, say, in Europe or in London or in the US. So without knowing this in detail, I'm pretty sure that looking at Russia, because it makes perfect sense. Something we had well, on Monday actually in London we interviewed for a position on Korea, and one of the interviewees actually is an expert on North Korean links with China and with Russia, economic links, as she has done fieldwork there. And one of the things she mentioned there is that it is not only North Koreans who are based in Russia, in the Russian Far East. There are actually many South Koreans who are based there. And the South Koreans, they are investing there, they are trading with the region, but they're also investing in the region. And I think she spent 2.5 years actually living, she's South Korean herself, living in the region. So she was making a very interesting point that we think about that region as, being populated by Chinese, North Koreans, and obviously Russians, but actually there are many South Koreans living there, doing business there, and she traced this back all the way to the 1990s. She says this is nothing new. Even before, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, when economic opportunities opened up, many South Koreans realized, there is somewhere I can operate. So there's definitely something going on there. But I wouldn't know in detail. Now, the other question, I think it's an important question. My impression is that South Korea sees itself as a creditor, but perceives that it could potentially be a borrower, right? But it portrays itself as a creditor, and I think that's quite obvious when you talk with South Korean officials in AMRO, some of whom are seconded from Korea, from Ministry of Finance, for example, and they spend a number of years there, and a couple that have been in AMRO since the inception, and they like life in Singapore, so they have decided to stay there. They don't want to go back to Korea for the time being, right? So they do see themselves as creditors, but in the same way that no one thinks that China and Japan are ever going to borrow from AMRO, and that no one thinks that Philippines, Laos, Cambodia are going to become creditors, with South Korea is somewhere in between. So it could be a potential borrower. And this is interesting because if you look at the dealing portion of the Chiang Mai Initiative, in theory, South Korea supports 40%, again, 50, 60, whatever is the link from the IMF. That's perfect for us, right? Because there's this problems that Korea had with the IMF in 1997, right? So this is perfect. But on the other hand, Korea thinks, well, if I'm a creditor, I would rather a country such as Indonesia, for example, have to comply with IMF conditionality, because that means that the likelihood of the money being paid back, or my contribution being paid back, is higher if there is lending to any of these countries in the region. So it seems to me that Korea is torn, and I think this is partially linked to the fact that in 2008 Korea had to go to the Federal Reserve, right? And actually this made them think, okay, we might need support from the US, or we might need to activate a bilateral swap arrangement with People's Bank of China, or we might have to go to this institution. So it makes you think differently. So it seems to be torn. On the Bank of Korea, I found it very interesting. I didn't know until some interviews I did last year, and then I have a friend who used to work there, and he introduced me to a bunch of people in the Bank of Korea. They realized that the demand for Korean won is not as high in the region as it is for renminbi, right? There's much more trade denominated in renminbi than there is for Korean won. So they are open to the possibility of this being done in dollars. It's not something they have discarded, right? In the same way that China wouldn't do it. China wouldn't say, okay, let's have a bilateral swap arrangement denominated in dollars. Korea wouldn't see this as a problem. But so far, of all the swap arrangements that Korea has with other countries, they are denominated in won, right? So that has been the trajectory so far, even though they are still open to the possibility of doing it in dollars, if necessary. And there seems to be demand in Southeast Asia because I think there was a bit of a shock about the extent to which China pushed for these bilateral swap arrangements, pushed for renminbi internationalization without really thinking about the partner. So as if it was a favor that China was doing to these countries, more than as a partnership between two central banks that decide to sign the swap arrangement. And I mean, I heard nasty things about these swap arrangements being signed by China. You know, they call it economic statecraft, and they call it about China trying to buy us up, or China trying to divide and rule, which is a discussion that we have in Europe as well. You know, trying to buy up some countries and divide them from other countries because of South China Sea, East China Sea, etc., etc., etc. And going back to the point that I made, nobody thinks in these terms about Korea. Nobody thinks, well, the Bank of Korea is doing this as a way for Korea to have leverage over our economy, and if we need, for example, to activate a swap arrangement, South Korea might demand something in return, right? For example, okay, we activate the swap arrangement, but in return you have to accept investment from a Korean heavy industry company in your country. That's not the perception, and I think here's where the demand is coming from. Obviously, they would be smaller than any swap arrangements with the Fed or the ACB or the People's Bank of China, but having this possibility obviously is very interesting for countries in the region. I never heard anyone say anything negative about the possibility of having this type of arrangements with South Korea, and you see the same with China. Even with Japan, there's the argument that Japan is only signing these swap arrangements because China is doing it. Not because they have an interest in the region, but China is doing it, so we have to do it, right? So this element of competition. But I haven't heard that from Korea either, you know, like, oh, Korea is doing this because Japan and China have done it. It's more about, okay, this is good for us, but, you know, even for Korea might be good because of this issue of contagion as well. So, yeah, there seems to be a positive view of this.
Hi, my name is Luke Lim from Asia Point. First, thank you for your presentation and discussion. My question is about the international relations in the Northeastern Asia. As you can see at the ASEAN Plus 3 and also the FTA among the Korea, Japan, and China, Korea is trying to be a broker for the bridge among the countries, but in fact, each bilateral relations between the Korea, Japan, or Korea and China, the relationship getting worse. For example, the swap deal between the Korea and Japan cannot, it doesn't seem to be expand sooner or later, and also the swap deal between the Korea and China will be expired in this month, maybe, as far as I know. So, can Korea be a real effective broker or the bridge between the giant country between the Japan and China? That's my question.
That's a good point. I think we have to differentiate between the high politics that sometimes might lead to less cooperation and what actually happens when officials who work in central banks, in Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Trade, for example, have to broker an agreement, right? So when you see Korea playing this bridge role, for example, often it's at the working level, no? At the working level, the technicalities about how the institution might actually work. So if you look at discussions, for example, about borrowing rights in the Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization. Now, borrowing rights, they were not necessarily discussed at the highest of level. At some point, this had to be sorted out by those who have a knowledge about how the institution might work, those who have a knowledge, for example, about how a central bank might have to operate if there is a crisis, and this has to be activated. So at that level, Korea actually plays a very important role. And it is true that sometimes high politics get in the way of this type of agreements, but the two agreements that you mentioned are actually bilateral agreements. Yes, and there are problems. I mean, with China, obviously, because of that, very important. With Japan, there's always the political issue. But if you look at the regional institutions, that's where you actually see Korea playing this bridge role between these two countries, plus developed and developing countries. And we should not forget that finance is a very technical field as well. It's not something that a prime minister or president wouldn't run a campaign on anything related to finance, right? Because voters would say, what are you talking about, right? Talk to me about jobs or whatever, right? This is not something that people normally discuss, right? It's very, very technical, and that's where you actually need the expertise and the people who might be willing to take a role that other countries would not necessarily want to take. And I think that's where the role of Korea is important. I'll tell you more when it comes to AMRO. When a delegation from AMRO visits a country to have a meeting to discuss the situation of your economy, the person leading the delegation is important. You won't see a Chinese leading a delegation to discuss with Japan the Japanese economy. But you can see a Korean leading a delegation to discuss with Japan the state of the Japanese economy, or with the state of the Chinese economy, or go to Hong Kong and do the same. And that's important because you have someone with the technical knowledge, but who is perceived again as someone with an honest broker that, you know, is not going to feed this information to his or her government, you know, so they can know what's going on in the country. So that's important. That's important as well. These people who actually do the work. Plus, what happens when you actually activate, if you activate the Chinese Multilateralization, what happens with the monitoring of the agreement? Let's say you are Cambodia. Would you, or maybe not Cambodia is not the best example, but let's say Vietnam now that has problems with China. Would Vietnam trust a delegation being led by a Chinese to monitor the agreement? Probably not. Would they have any problems with a Korean doing this? Probably not. You know, if it's a Korean, perfectly fine. You know, we have no political problems with them, so we can do so. So it's this type of more technical day-to-day work and operation of the agreements where I think Korea plays this important role, and it's difficult sometimes for others. And as I said, I mean, you need to have the technical knowledge as well. So because you need to have the technical knowledge, immediately there are many different countries that might not have enough human resources to do this role. And Korea has the resources plus the view that it can actually do this in an honest way.
I'm wondering how you think the anti-Chaebol sentiment of Moon Jae-in and his policy advisor Song are going to affect all of this. It would seem to undermine the whole foreign policy approach as well as the sort of centralized financial policy.
I'll tell you this from the perspective of the interviews that I had recently when I was there. So after Moon was appointed, I've been twice actually, not only once but twice. Once in August and another one in June, if I remember correctly. And I had the chance to discuss this, as you say, anti-Chaebol sentiment. First of all, going back to my work about the creative economy or startups, but also going to discussions about what might happen with Chaebol themselves. Chaebols are central to the startup ecosystem. So, for example, when there are meetings in the Ministry of SMEs and Startups about how to develop the financial the entrepreneurial ecosystem, Chaebols sit at the table. When it comes to the creative economy centers that you have around the country, there are 18 of them. Chaebols, each center has a Chaebol that provides guidance, that can provide funding, that can also buy some of these startups if they become successful. So even when we talk about support for SMEs and startups, you see how Chaebols actually play a role. They are not being replaced by these startups. They're actually working together with them. Plus this anti-Chaebol sentiment, I think my impression is that Moon is not the first president who talks about reforming Chaebols, right? I mean, Kim Dae-jung talked about this, No Mo-kyung as well. Even to an extent, Park and Lee Moon-bak, they also said, well, we're going to reform the Chaebols. They are too powerful in the country. I think it is very difficult for companies that have been so successful and that they still create many jobs. And we shouldn't forget that many young Korean graduates, they want to work in a Chaebol, right? I mean, if only because the salaries are better. So you want to have a nice salary, you want to work in Samsung or LG, and actually your marriage prospects are better, right? If you date, it's better to work in LG or Samsung than work in a startup in Korea. A friend of mine married someone from LG, and she wouldn't consider anyone who wasn't from a chaebol. So then we go to this level, right? So if only because they're still seen as important companies that offer good career prospects. I think the reform might be more trying to making them more transparent. And if you look, the legislation is there. So if the legislation that Korea has were to be implemented, chaebols would be more transparent, and this cross-shareholding wouldn't be as important as it is today, and it would be, if not eliminated, it would be less central to the ownership structure of chaebols. So you only need to apply the law in Korea now. But if you look at the law, the way it would be applied, it wouldn't be about, like you might have in other countries, about considering a particular chaebol a monopoly. Therefore, it has to be split up between different businesses. And I haven't heard Moon say we have to do this. He's talking more about the governance, and he's trying to make them part of this broader move of the economy into other sectors. If you look at something that I always find very interesting, if you look at the most innovative regions in the world by the number of patents, you see that number one is the Tokyo region. Number two, I think, is Kansai. By number 3 and number 4, you have the Seoul region and the Daecheon region, right? Because you have the university, I forgot the name of the university, KAIST in Daecheon, right? If you look at how innovation works in KAIST, you see how chaebols are central to it. They work together with chaebols, right, to create innovative products, for example, in biotechnology or robotics, right? So you see chaebols being part of this development of new industries that are supposed to replace older industries in which Korea is becoming less competitive, let's say shipbuilding, for example. So I think you have the rhetoric, and I think it is true that Moon is going to try to rein on the chaebols, if only for them to become more transparent, and maybe have more professionalized management in which not only family members are at the helm of the chaebols, but I honestly don't think that there's going to be a substantial change. And I don't even think that Koreans want a really substantial change. I'll give you one last example maybe to finish, but talking to entrepreneurs in Korea, many of them, they want to keep their business, so they want to see it grow, but there are also many entrepreneurs that would be very happy for Samsung or SK or Lotte to buy their startup and, afterwards have a very comfortable life, right? In the same way that many people in the US might think, okay, if I sell my company to Google, I can retire, my kids can retire, and my grandkids can actually retire. So even these people who, in theory, are launching a business that, in the future could compete with a chaebol in a particular sector, they see this as a viable exit option. So that's why I think that won't change as much.
Well, we're out of time, but you joked about how finance is this technical issue, but I think you've done a really great job today of making it very clear, and as well as not showing it's not only a technical thing, but it's just as much about political economic issues as well. So thank you again for not only the great presentation, but your great comments during the Q&A, and please join me in thanking Dr. Pacheco-Pardo.
Thank you.